Forget the marble columns. Forget the triumphal processions and golden laurel wreaths. If you were a typical Roman citizen, not a senator, not a general, not even a patrician, your life began in a cramped, smoky apartment in a building one strong breeze away from collapse. Most urban Romans lived in insulae, multi-story apartment blocks stacked like shoeboxes, built hastily and cheaply to cram as many tenants as possible into Rome's swelling districts. Especially in the Suburra, a notorious neighborhood wedged between the imperial forums and the Esquiline Hill, these buildings could rise up to 6 or 7 stories high. There were no elevators, no fire escapes, and certainly no building inspectors. The higher your flat, the poorer your prospects. Why? Because the first and second floors often had access to piped water, brick walls, tiled floors, and real toilets. But the upper levels were typically made of wood and plaster. They shook in the wind. They leaked in the rain. Their stairways were narrow, steep, and lethal. And if a fire broke out, as they often did, it was the top floors that turned into death traps first. Your room might have one window, perhaps two. It certainly wouldn't be insulated. In winter, you froze. In summer, you sweltered. Light came from a flickering oil lamp, smoky and unreliable. Ventilation was nearly non-existent. Cooking inside was dangerous, so many relied on street vendors or communal hearths. The walls were thin. You heard everything: arguments, crying babies, furniture scraping, drunken singing, domestic violence, and the occasional collapse of a stairwell or ceiling beam. Privacy was a fantasy. Hygiene, worse. Toilet facilities, if present, were shared by dozens, sometimes hundreds. Many simply used chamber pots and hurled their contents into the street. Cloaca Maxima, Rome's grand sewer, couldn't keep up. Flies, rats, and disease were daily realities. The stench was unavoidable. Yet these insulae were not isolated islands. They teemed with life. Shopkeepers ran businesses from the ground floors: taverns, barbers, bakers, butchers, prostitutes. Children played in alleyways. Laundry flapped between buildings. Peddlers called out their wares from pushcarts. Noise was constant. So was movement. Despite the hardship, there was community. You knew your neighbors. You shared tools, gossip, food, and complaints about corrupt landlords. For many, the Insula was all they knew. Some were born there, worked there, married there, and died there without ever seeing the countryside, let alone the Senate House or Forum. If you had a trade, say as a cobbler, potter, or mason, you might keep your tools beneath your bed. You would rise with the sun, join the flood of humanity down to the street, and return long after dark, your body aching, your purse light. You might rent your space monthly or daily. Eviction was quick and heartless. Rome's urban poor had no safety net. Fires swept through neighborhoods regularly. Earthquakes happened. Building collapses killed scores at a time. The emperors, aware of the danger, occasionally mandated safety reforms or distributed free grain and wine to appease the masses. But for the most part, your well-being depended on luck, patronage, and grit. Archaeological evidence from places like Ostia, Rome's port city, shows us the layout of these tenements: compact rooms, shared latrines, stairwells wide enough for a child, but not a stretcher. Inscriptions and graffiti offer insights into daily frustrations, rent disputes, love affairs, rivalries between factions, snide remarks about noisy neighbors, or cheating merchants. The Suburra and other working-class districts weren't just overcrowded. They were a pressure cooker of ambition, desperation, and ingenuity. From here emerged bakers who earned enough to sponsor local games, freedmen who became small-scale landlords, courtesans who controlled networks of influence, and also, inevitably, thousands who left no name behind. Life in a Roman insula was defined by limitation of space, comfort, privacy, and stability, but it was also where the Roman spirit endured, not in marble statues or triumphal arches, but in the clatter of dishes, the laughter of children, the crackle of firewood, and the dogged insistence to survive. To be an average Roman citizen was to live in the shadow of grandeur, but also in its foundations, because the empire didn't stand on senator speeches or imperial campaigns. It stood on the backs of the people crammed into crumbling walls, who got up each day and made Rome function. They weren't remembered, but they were everything. If you were an average Roman citizen, not a senator, not a patrician, not enslaved, you earned your living with your hands, your back, or your voice. You didn't command armies or oversee provinces. You worked, because survival in the Roman world wasn't a given. It was a daily negotiation between toil, chance, and the mercy of your patrons or the gods. Let's start with the basics. What kind of work did most Romans do? In a sprawling metropolis like Rome, the empire's glittering capital, the majority of citizens were urban laborers. They lived in cramped insulae, often the same buildings described in Chapter 1, and descended each morning into the dusty, noisy, chaotic streets to make their way. Many were artificers, artisans who plied skilled trades passed down through families. There were fabbri, carpenters, orifices, goldsmiths, figuli, potters, suitors, shoemakers, and full ones, fullers who cleaned cloth. These people might work from a home shop, a rented stall, or as part of a small collective in the poorer parts of the city. They earned modestly but could maintain some sense of independence. If you had a good reputation, a reliable clientele, and a fortunate few years, you might even save enough to employ an assistant or apprentice. Then there were the mercenarii, day laborers who had no shop, no tools of their own, and no guaranteed employment. They stood at street corners or in labor markets like the Forum Holatorium or near the Circus Maximus, hoping to be hired for the day. Tasks could include carrying amphiry, cleaning latrines, digging foundations, or hauling stone. Some found casual work on building projects or in the transport of goods from Rome's port at Ostia. Others were hired as messengers, errand runners, or funeral bearers. The pay was meager, the conditions were brutal, and if no one needed you that day, you didn't eat. Rome was constantly under construction. From aqueducts to amphitheaters, the city groaned with expansion. The men who built these structures were not slaves, at least not all of them. A considerable portion were free workers, often citizens or freedmen desperate for income. They wielded pickaxes, mixed lime for mortar, hauled massive stones on primitive cranes, and worked from precarious scaffolding with no safety rails. The risk of injury or death was high, but the alternative was unemployment. If you had access to slightly more capital or training, you might become a pister, baker, a tonsor, barber, or a capo innkeeper. Bakers in particular played an essential role in Roman urban life. Bread was a staple food, especially for the poor. A baker with access to cheap grain, a reliable oven, and a good street location could support a family, but it wasn't glamorous. The work was hot, dusty, and relentless. For women, options were even more restricted. Roman law and custom discouraged women from participating in many trades, but economic necessity didn't care about decorum. Women worked, often invisibly, often unpaid, but always present. They prepared food for sale, washed laundry, spun and wove textiles, acted as midwives, healed the sick with herbal remedies, and managed taverns. Some even dealt in money lending or property rentals. In the poorer districts of Rome, a woman's labor was essential to household survival. Many urban Romans were freedmen, formerly enslaved people who had gained their freedom. They occupied a strange space in Roman society, no longer property, yet never entirely equal to freeborn citizens. They could not run for political office, but they could own property, vote, and conduct business. Some became prosperous traders or skilled craftsmen. Others continued to work in their former master's household as paid retainers. A few even rose to considerable influence, notably in the imperial bureaucracy, where freedmen often held powerful administrative positions. But for every success story, there were thousands of freedmen and citizens scraping by as lenons, pimps, gamblers, or petty traders of stolen goods. The streets of Rome were not paved with gold. They were littered with competition. Roman society officially disdained manual labor, at least among the elite. Philosophers like Cicero believed that physical work was degrading and suitable only for slaves or the desperate. Yet without laborers, Rome would have starved, flooded, and collapsed. Temples would remain unbuilt, sewage would back up, and grain would rot on ships in the Tiber. Behind every grand procession or imperial decree, there were 1,000 exhausted hands. Wages varied widely depending on skill and circumstance. A day laborer might earn 3 to 4 asses, small bronze coins, per day. That could buy bread, cheap wine, and possibly beans, but little else. A skilled artisan might earn several denarii, silver coins, per week, allowing for more stable food, the occasional meat purchase, and maybe even savings. But this depended heavily on demand, health, and luck. There were no unions. No pensions. If your tools broke or your child fell ill, you were in trouble. Certain professions carried higher status, even among the working class. A scribe or secretary with literacy skills might find steady work with a magistrate or merchant. A medicus, doctor, if trained and reputable, could command respect. Teachers, philosophers, and rhetoricians earned both admiration and ridicule depending on their clientele, but access to education, even basic literacy, was a privilege a few poor Romans enjoyed. Rome's bustling markets were full of small traders, spice merchants, butchers, fishmongers, vegetable sellers, fabric dealers. Many rented stalls from wealthy landlords. They lived under constant threat of eviction, price fluctuations, and tax collectors. Roman taxation was often privatized. Wealthy equestrians bought the right to collect taxes in a given area, then squeezed every coin they could. It was legalized extortion, and the working class bore the brunt of it. Then there were the informal economies: gambling dens, street performers, fortune tellers, and sex workers. Prostitution was legal, taxable, and omnipresent. Some women and men chose the trade out of desperation. Others worked in brothels, lupinaria, under the thumb of lenons or madams. Rome had no illusions about virtue. It had markets for everything. Despite the grinding hardship, there were moments of relief. Public festivals provided rare days off. The ludi, games at the Circus Maximus, drew huge crowds. Chariot racing, a gladiatorial combat, and theatrical performances offered escapism and catharsis. And for those lucky enough to be registered for the grain dole, the annona, a small but regular food supply, offered stability. In some cities and regions, especially in the provinces, rural labor dominated. Tenant farmers, vineyard workers, and shepherds endured lives of isolation and seasonal poverty. They were less visible in the heart of Rome, but they fed it, and Rome always demanded more food. It's worth noting that for some, military service offered an escape from poverty. Enlistment in the Roman legions could lead to a regular wage, citizenship for non-citizens, and eventually a land grant upon retirement. But that came after 20 to 25 years of brutal campaigning, if you survived. For the average Roman already holding citizenship, military service was an option, but rarely the first choice. Most Romans were not heroes or villains. They weren't gladiators or emperors. They were bakers, masons, carriers, and launderers. Their lives were not marked by glory, but by a quiet, constant negotiation with necessity. They made the empire run, not for honor, but for bread. Their stories were rarely written down. Their names, more often than not, disappeared with their final pay. But if we listen closely to the city they built, we can still hear their footsteps, early in the morning, heavy from work, echoing through the stone corridors of history. Let's forget the feasts for a moment. Forget the tables heaped with flamingo tongues, oysters from Baiae, and stuffed dormice lounging in honeyed sauce. Those were luxuries for the elite. Senators, magnates, emperors with too much time and even more coin. If you were an average Roman citizen, living in a fourth-floor walk-up with no kitchen, no servants, and no marble banquet hall, your food was simpler, your routine was stricter, and your day revolved around the pursuit of the same thing, over and over: sustenance. The Roman working day began early, very early. Most people were up before dawn. There were no alarm clocks, just the stir of neighbors rising, animals braying in courtyards, the echo of iron shutters thrown open, and the first crier announcing the opening of the markets. Breakfast, ianticulum, was not a feast. It was practical. It was often stale bread, possibly dipped in watered wine, milk, or sometimes oil. If you were lucky, you might add a piece of cheese or dried fruit. Eggs, if you had them, were boiled and expensive enough to be saved for later in the day. There was no expectation of variety. Romans believed in function before flavor, especially those who had neither kitchens nor coin to indulge. Some grabbed breakfast on the way to work, stopping at street vendors for a warm flatbread, a bowl of pulse, a basic porridge made of grains and water, or small fritters fried in oil. Work began with the sun. Markets opened. Hammers rang out from workshops. The smell of charred fish guts, vinegar, and animal dung rose with the heat. The city was alive and already hungry again. The main meal of the day was typically eaten in the early afternoon and called cena. This might seem strange, to eat your big meal before sunset, but for the working poor, it made sense. The light was still good, the air marginally cooler, and there was time left to return to work, rest, or head to the baths. If you had the means and the space to cook, your staples were grains, legumes, vegetables, and cheap cuts of meat, often salted or boiled. Roman cuisine at the lower end was a clever mix of improvisation and preservation. Fresh ingredients were rare luxuries. Most food was dried, smoked, salted, or pickled. Bread was everything. Coarse and heavy, often full of grit from poorly milled flour, it formed the basis of most meals. You dipped it in oil, ate it with olives, or soaked it in broth to soften it. Pulse was another staple, a kind of ancient polenta made from farro or barley. It could be flavored with herbs, cheese, or whatever scraps of meat you could afford. This was the lifeblood of the Roman kitchen, easy to make, endlessly adaptable, and filling. Vegetables were the commonest friend. Cabbage, onions, garlic, turnips, chickpeas, lentils, all cheap, grown in pots or allotments, and sold in heaping bundles in local markets. Romans boiled everything. Salads existed, but raw grains were considered dangerous. Boiled beets and leeks with vinegar and oil? That was closer to a peasant's delicacy. As for meat, it wasn't out of reach, but it was rationed. Sausages made from questionable animal parts were affordable. So was salted fish paste, garum, the infamous Roman condiment made by fermenting fish guts in the sun. The smell was overwhelming, but the umami punch turned otherwise bland meals into something memorable. Fish, when fresh, was costly. So were chickens and pigs. Cattle? Forget it. Most of your protein came from legumes and, when possible, eggs. If you were lucky or well-connected, you might get occasional handouts of grain or wine from a patron, or benefit from the annona, Rome's grain dole. This was the government's way of keeping the city's massive urban population fed and docile. But even then, you had to grind the flour yourself, or pay someone to do it, then find a communal oven to bake your bread. Supper, vesperna, was light or skipped entirely. Many Roman workers returned home exhausted, sometimes full from the midday cena, and simply drank watered wine, the standard beverage of every class. Roman wine wasn't like modern vintages. It was strong, sweet, and often mixed with seawater, herbs, or resin. Drunkenness was common, but among the working class, it was a cheap way to relax sore muscles and forget the day's pains. Taverns, taberni, offered communal drinking spaces where regulars argued politics, gossiped, or threw dice by torchlight. Supper might be leftovers, porridge, fruit, or more bread. Or perhaps street food, hot lentil stew in a clay bowl, grilled chickpea patties, or stuffed pastries. Rome's night markets did brisk trade until curfew. As darkness settled, the city changed. The wealthy retreated into walled gardens. The poor shuttered their windows. Lanterns flickered in alleyways. The noise dimmed, slightly. And in hundreds of cramped tenements, people dozed off beneath itchy blankets, hoping for cool air and dreamless sleep. Beyond meals, daily routines were full of minor negotiations with the city, the body, and other people. Water had to be fetched. While Rome's aqueducts supplied public fountains, many insulae didn't have direct access. If you lived on a higher floor, you hauled it up manually. Wealthier tenants on the ground floor paid extra rent for plumbing. Everyone else carried jars up and down stairs, sometimes several times a day. Fire was precious, for heat, for cooking, for light, but it was also dangerous. Open flames caused hundreds of deadly blazes each year. Many apartment buildings banned cooking altogether. That's why thermopolia, ancient snack bars, dotted the streets. These were small shops with stone counters, built-in jars, dolia of hot food, and little else. The poor relied on them daily, just as modern city dwellers rely on takeaway. Bathing was public, regular, and central to Roman life. The average citizen visited the baths, thermae, several times a week, or daily if affordable. Baths weren't just about hygiene, they were social hubs. You exercised, bathed, chatted, networked, and maybe even sealed a deal. Entry was cheap, sometimes free. But soap was rare. Olive oil was used to cleanse the skin, then scraped off with a curved metal tool called a strigil. Work generally ended in the early afternoon. After cena, people might nap, visit friends, stroll through the forum, attend minor religious festivals, or go to the amphitheater for a play or gladiatorial show. But leisure was brief. Romans, especially the poor, lived in bodies worn down by repetition. In the countryside, where the majority of the Roman population still lived, routines were even more tightly bound to nature. Farmers rose with the first light and worked until dusk, plowing, sowing, reaping, harvesting olives or grapes depending on the season. Meals were plain: porridge, beans, onions, bread. Sometimes goat's milk or wild grains. Meat was rare, usually reserved for religious sacrifices or festivals. Unlike the city, there were no public baths, no thermopolia. Cleanliness was rudimentary. Entertainment came from festivals, family, or wine shared by firelight. Winter brought some relief, but also dread. Crops failed, food spoiled, roofs leaked. Spring was a time of hunger. Between the exhaustion of winter stores and the first growth of crops, rural Romans lived closer to the edge than their urban counterparts, who at least had grain doles or street vendors. Still, in both worlds, people ate to survive, not to indulge. To the average Roman, feasts were stories. You heard of them in gossip, saw glimpses through the gates of villas, maybe even served at one if you worked as a slave or servant. Lavish dinners with 12 courses, acrobats, slaves pouring wine, tables with ivory legs, those were fantasies. Aspirations, not your daily reality. Yet food remained tied to identity. You ate what your class permitted. Your daily diet told others who you were. Coarse bread and pulse meant poverty. Fresh vegetables and cheese suggested modest means. Fish, meat, and honey marked wealth. Exotic spices? That was a signal of status, and often excess. Romans moralized food, too. Philosophers preached temperance. Gluttony was scorned as effeminate or unmanly. The ideal citizen, especially in the Republican imagination, was austere, disciplined, frugal. To eat simply was to be virtuous. Yet the reality was more complex. Many people ate simply because they had no choice. So what did daily life taste like for an ordinary Roman? It tasted of grain, of vinegar, of leeks boiled too long, of bread dipped in oil, then again and again. It tasted of improvisation, resourcefulness, and the occasional sweet plum or scrap of smoked pork when fortune smiled. It wasn't grand, but it was communal. You ate in shared courtyards, at crowded market counters, beside your children on uneven floors. And in those moments, breaking bread, sipping sour wine, you carved out a kind of peace. The Roman world didn't run on conquest alone. It ran on bellies full enough to go to work the next day. Rome wasn't quiet, it wasn't polite, and it most certainly wasn't boring. To live as an average Roman citizen meant enduring constant noise, crowds, heat, smells, and the clatter of a city that never truly slept. But within that chaos was the heartbeat of Roman identity, a world of forums, circuses, taverns, and theaters, where public life wasn't just a civic duty. It was a spectacle. If food and work kept the Roman body alive, public entertainment and communal spaces kept the Roman spirit ticking. Every Roman city had a forum. In Rome itself, the Forum Romanum was the buzzing epicenter of civic life. It was a strange hybrid, part open-air market, part political stage, part religious sanctuary, and part legal battleground. If you were a citizen with a grievance, say a neighbor had encroached on your wall, or a merchant had sold you spoiled wine, you might seek out a magistrate here. Trials took place in public, often outdoors. Spectators gathered not only to watch, but to heckle or cheer. There were also announcements, proclamations, and speeches. Politicians campaigning for office strolled the paving stones in pristine white togas, candidates, from which we get candidate, shaking hands and buying favor. But the average Roman wasn't here to change history. They came for the noise, the rumors, and maybe a few sesterces from a wealthy patron. It was in the forum that news traveled of a gladiator's death, a grain shortage, or an imperial decree from a city far away. It was where old men argued about wars they hadn't fought, where street preachers railed against sin, and where satirists scrawled insults on public walls. And if you didn't care for politics, you could buy a fig, listen to a lyre, or gamble on dice behind a column until the vigiles caught you. More than temples, more than homes, more than theaters, the public baths were where Romans met, mingled, relaxed, and gossiped. They were the great leveler. Entry was cheap, just a few asses for citizens. Sometimes free, sponsored by a local magistrate seeking popularity. And inside, the experience was far richer than the price suggested. You'd begin by exercising in the palestra, an open courtyard where men practiced wrestling, ball games, or weight training. Then came the bathing circuit, the tepidarium, warm room, the caldarium, hot room, and the frigidarium, cold plunge. The sequence was a dance: steam, sweat, scrape, and soak. There were masseurs with oil, slaves with towels, philosophers holding court, merchants cutting deals. It was where the city breathed, literally and socially. For the poor, the baths were a clean break from filth and stress. For women who had separate hours or separate spaces, they were places to unwind and reconnect. For all, they were Roman, as essential as the forum, the temple, or the street corner. And yes, sometimes there was mischief. The poet Martial joked about bathhouse thieves and loudmouths. But even he admitted, no one avoided the baths. They were too essential, too pleasurable, too Roman. The phrase panem et circenses, bread and circuses, wasn't just political satire. It was a survival strategy. Keep the masses fed and entertained, and you reduce the risk of revolt. And so, Roman public life revolved around two great spectacles, chariot racing and gladiatorial combat. The Circus Maximus, nestled between the Palatine and Aventine hills, could hold over 150,000 people. Entry was free. Seating was determined by status. Senators and equestrians at the front, the poor crammed in at the top. But once the races began, social lines blurred. Romans divided themselves into factions, the Reds, Greens, Blues, and Whites, each supporting a team of charioteers. Fights broke out, bets were placed, children screamed, women threw scarves, grown men wept at the sight of a favorite charioteer being trampled under hooves. The races were violent, fast, and dangerously addictive. Charioteers, often slaves or freedmen, could become celebrities. The most successful earned fortunes and sometimes freedom. But the job was deadly. Accidents were common. The crowd loved it. The Colosseum, or Amphitheatrum Flavium, was Rome's crown jewel of death. Here, gladiators fought animals, each other, and sometimes full-scale mock battles involving hundreds of fighters. Again, entry was free. Funded by the emperor or the ultra-wealthy, these games were political theater, generosity framed in blood. Gladiators were a strange mix of celebrity and property. They were trained professionals, slaves, criminals, prisoners of war, but they had fans, merchandise, and chants. Some won their freedom by surviving long enough. Others died anonymously to cheers and cheap wine. Not all citizens loved the games. Philosophers complained. Early Christians abhorred them. But most Romans, especially the poor, couldn't resist. The violence was catharsis. It made the powerless feel powerful, if only for a few hours. For those who preferred words to blood, there was the theater. Roman drama included tragedy, comedy, mime, and satire, while elite theater borrowed from Greek models and performed in grand marble structures. The common Roman favored ribald farce and slapstick. Plays were bawdy. Actors wore masks. Jokes were crude, aimed at politicians, in-laws, or foreigners. Mimes especially thrived on vulgarity, sexual humor, impersonations, and open mockery of authority. Women could attend, so could slaves. Audiences were loud and opinionated. They booed bad performances, demanded encores, and sometimes threw vegetables. Poets like Plautus and Terence became household names, but the theater was never highbrow. It was earthy, irreverent, and brilliantly alive. And sometimes the theater blurred into politics. Satirists like Juvenal and Lucilius embedded scathing critiques into verse, disguised enough to avoid exile, sharp enough to sting. Even emperors attended, if only to be seen. Not every Roman could attend the baths or the circus daily, but every Roman had the street, and the street had tabernae. These small shops, part bar, part restaurant, part gossip den, served watered wine, beans, salted fish, and conversation. They were noisy, smoky, and full of tension. Fights broke out. Thieves worked the crowd, but they were home to the common man. Festivals brought the most excitement. Rome's religious calendar was packed, over 150 public holidays by the imperial period. Some were solemn, others were chaotic. During Saturnalia, the social order inverted. Slaves dined with masters, gambling was legal, gifts were exchanged, and drunkenness was expected. During Lupercalia, priests ran through the streets, striking people with goatskin thongs for fertility. During the Ludi Romani, entire weeks were given over to games, races, and public rituals. The average Roman, weary from work, adored these holidays. They were breaks from survival, from structure, from being overlooked. And even outside of official festivals, street performers entertained. Musicians played reed pipes. Jugglers juggled. Fortune tellers read omens in animal guts or bird flight. Gambling dens thrived in alleys, despite legal restrictions. Rome was not a quiet city, but it was never dull. Public life wasn't confined to grand spaces. It lived in whispers, in scrawled graffiti, in rumors passed in the forum or over cheap wine. Roman walls were covered in messages, some poetic, others obscene. A baker insults a rival. A prostitute advertises her rates. A gladiator boasts of victories. A citizen prays for vengeance on a cheating lover. These were the Twitter feeds of antiquity, raw, personal, and often hilarious. Even in silence, the city spoke. Gossip was a national sport. Romans gossiped in baths, taverns, markets, and temples about politics, about scandals, about neighbors. Everyone was watching. Everyone was talking. To be Roman was to participate, loudly, passionately, and often with a touch of vulgarity. For the average Roman, life was public by default. You ate with strangers. You bathed with them. You argued beside them in the forum. You watched men die for sport, and then walked home past children playing dice in the street. Privacy was rare. Silence, rarer still. But in this crowded, chaotic world, public life offered something profound: belonging. You might be poor, you might be powerless, but in the Circus Maximus, you were part of the crowd. In the baths, you shared space with senators. At the theater, your laughter drowned the aristocrat's sigh. You weren't rich, you weren't noble, but you were Roman, and that meant something. If you were an average Roman citizen, religion was not a matter of belief. It was a matter of habit. The Roman world did not ask, "Do you believe in the gods?" It asked, "Have you offered your sacrifice? Have you performed the rite? Have you honored the spirits who watch your home, your street, your city, and your emperor?" Religion was not abstract. It was embedded in daily life, in ash on your doorstep, in garlands on doorposts, in whispered prayers over bread, and in the careful choice of a lucky day to trim your hair. And behind it all was one powerful motivation: to avoid divine wrath. Let's begin at home, the true heart of Roman religious life. Every Roman household, no matter how poor, honored a set of Lauras and Penettes. These were not mighty Olympians like Jupiter or Mars, but domestic spirits, guardians of the home, hearth, food stores, and lineage. They lived in a lararium, a tiny household shrine, often a simple niche in the wall or a small altar above the hearth. Before eating, a Roman might toss a bit of bread or wine to these spirits. Children were taught to greet them each morning. Important milestones, a marriage, a birth, a soldier's return, were marked with special offerings. Even in a squalid tenement, you tried to keep the Lauras happy. Angry spirits meant misfortune, spoiled food, illness, fire, or bad dreams. Then there was the genius, not a clever person, but your personal spirit. Every man had a genius, every woman a Juno. This spiritual double represented your life force. On birthdays, you honored your genius with a libation or incense. Some families kept tiny busts to represent them. This wasn't religion for salvation. It was religion for survival, a way of negotiating with unseen powers, a spiritual insurance policy. Rome's religious life extended far beyond the home. It was woven into every part of public identity. To be Roman was to participate in public religion, whether or not your heart was in it. Temples dotted every district, each dedicated to a different god. Jupiter Optimus Maximus ruled the Capitoline Hill. Juno Moneta protected the Mint. Vesta kept her eternal flame burning in the Forum, watched over by 6 virgins sworn to chastity. Mars, Minerva, Diana, Apollo, all had their cults and precincts. Each god had their own priesthood, ceremonies, and calendar of feast days. As a citizen, you didn't need to love the gods. You needed to respect them. You showed pietas, dutiful devotion, by attending public festivals, giving offerings, and obeying religious taboos. Missing a festival wasn't impious, but mocking a ritual, disrupting a sacrifice, that was dangerous, not just for you, but for the city. Romans believed that gods could punish not only individuals, but whole communities. A botched sacrifice, an impure priest, a dishonored oath. Any of these could bring plague, fire, famine, or defeat in war. So rituals were conducted with obsessive precision. Animals were examined for omens. Words were spoken in exact order. Even a sneeze at the wrong moment could cancel a ceremony and force a restart. There was no church, no holy book, no central doctrine. But there was structure, and plenty of it. Priests came from the aristocracy. Offices like the Pontifex Maximus, chief priest, were coveted political roles. Religion and governance were inseparable. Every Senate meeting began with a sacrifice. Every triumphal procession passed the temples. Every major building had its own consecration. The gods were everywhere, in statues, rituals, festivals, and oaths. You swore by them. You thanked them. You feared them. But you didn't love them. That wasn't the point. Despite its seriousness, Roman religion was not grim. In fact, it was often an excuse for celebration. Rome's religious calendar was packed with feast days, over 150 per year by the imperial era. These weren't just ceremonies. They were holidays, time off work, public games, free food, wild processions. Take Saturnalia, for example, held in December in honor of the god Saturn. For several days, social norms were upended. Masters served slaves. Gambling was permitted. People wore silly hats and exchanged gifts. It was riotous, crude, and beloved. Even the sternest philosopher cracked a smile. Or Lupercalia, a February festival involving half-naked men running through the streets, striking women with thongs made from goat hide to promote fertility. It was part ritual, part farce, and entirely Roman. There were also harvest festivals, military commemorations, and days honoring particular deities. Some included sacrifices, oxen, pigs, sheep. Others had races, plays, or public banquets. Even poor citizens attended. It was their chance to taste roasted meat, see famous actors, or shout themselves hoarse at a chariot race. In these festivals, you saw Roman religion at its most vivid, part ritual, part entertainment, and fully public. Visiting a temple wasn't like going to a church or synagogue. Temples weren't places for congregation. They were the homes of gods. You didn't sit in pews. You stood outside, gave your offering, made your prayer, and left. Offerings could be anything: coins, fruit, cakes, flowers, incense. Wealthier citizens gave animals. The priest performed the sacrifice, examined the entrails for omens, and burned the appropriate parts. The rest might be eaten by the priest, the donor, or during major festivals by the crowd. Some temples had cult statues so large they were said to breathe. Others were humble roadside shrines. Many neighborhoods had Capitalia, crossroads shrines to local spirits. These were managed by locals, not priests. Even slaves could participate. Religion was not confined to sacred spaces. It was everywhere. You made the sign of the horns to ward off evil. You spat 3 times to avoid misfortune. You crossed thresholds with the right foot. You avoided certain words or days. You feared eclipses, comets, and owls. Which brings us to the undercurrent of Roman faith, superstition. The Roman world was full of unexplained forces. And where explanation failed, superstition filled the gap. Every action could carry symbolic weight. A black cat crossing your path? Bad luck. A snake in your house? A message from the gods. Dreamt of a tooth falling out? Someone close to you would die. You didn't have to be religious to be superstitious. Even emperors consulted soothsayers and astrologers. The General Sulla never left home without checking the entrails. Augustus claimed to have been conceived under a special star. Omens were everywhere, birds flying left or right, thunder at the wrong time, a sudden gust of wind. Augurs, religious officials trained in divination, interpreted these signs before major state decisions. Their readings could delay elections, postpone battles, or justify political maneuvers. Then there were curses, thin lead tablets inscribed with maledictions, buried in graves or thrown into wells. People cursed cheating lovers, rival charioteers, and dishonest business partners. Some even hired professional curse writers. Witches, love potions, and protective charms abounded. Children wore bull amulets to protect against the evil eye. Homes hung phallic talismans to ward off envy. Farmers used spells to protect crops. Even educated Romans kept lucky charms hidden in their tunics. Official religion tolerated some of this, but go too far, especially into necromancy or foreign cults, and the authorities took notice. Despite official reverence for Roman deities, the city teemed with foreign cults. From the east came Isis, the Egyptian goddess of motherhood and mystery, Mithras, the bull-slaying god of soldiers, and Cybele, the great mother whose worship included ecstatic dances and self-castration. These cults promised something Roman religion didn't: personal connection, hope after death, and initiation into sacred knowledge. Many poor Romans found meaning here. The cults offered structure, purpose, even fellowship, but they also faced suspicion. Foreign rites were considered unmanly, disruptive, or secretive, dangerous traits in a society obsessed with public order. Christianity emerged in this mix. At first, it was just another Eastern sect, but its refusal to honor the Roman gods, especially the divine emperor, brought state hostility. Persecution followed: executions, torture, martyrdom. Still, the appeal spread. By the 3rd century, Christian congregations had taken root across the empire. And then the 4th, Rome would shift forever. Constantine converted. The old gods fell silent. But during the high point of Roman urban life, most people, average people, didn't hear sermons. They lit incense. They muttered charms. They feared ghosts. They thanked the Lares for another day. Religion in Rome was not about personal salvation. It was about tradition, respect, and risk management. The gods were real. They had expectations. And if you wanted your daughter to recover from a fever, your shop to survive the year, or your cousin to win his appeal, you made an offering. You might not remember the myths. You might not know your temple from your augur. But you knew this: honor the old ways, and maybe you'd stay lucky. Roman religion was everywhere. In the salt on your bread, the coin you tossed in the fountain, the quiet prayer before a journey, the nod toward a street shrine. It was not one god, it was thousands. Not one truth, but hundreds of traditions held together by habit, fear, and hope. And in the middle of it all stood the average Roman, faithful not out of zeal, but out of necessity. If you were an average Roman citizen, religion was not a matter of belief. It was a matter of habit. The Roman world did not ask, "Do you believe in the gods?" It asked, "Have you offered your sacrifice? Have you performed the rite? Have you honored the spirits who watch your home, your street, your city, and your emperor?" Religion was not abstract. It was embedded in daily life, in ash on your doorstep, in garlands on doorposts, in whispered prayers over bread, and in the careful choice of a lucky day to trim your hair. And behind it all was one powerful motivation: to avoid divine wrath. Let's begin at home, the true heart of Roman religious life. Every Roman household, no matter how poor, honored a set of Lares and Penetes. These were not mighty Olympians like Jupiter or Mars, but domestic spirits, guardians of the home, hearth, food stores, and lineage. They lived in a lararium, a tiny household shrine, often a simple niche in the wall or a small altar above the hearth. Before eating, a Roman might toss a bit of bread or wine to these spirits. Children were taught to greet them each morning. Important milestones, a marriage, a birth, a soldier's return, were marked with special offerings. Even in a squalid tenement, you tried to keep the Lares happy. Angry spirits meant misfortune, spoiled food, illness, fire, or bad dreams. Then there was the genius, not a clever person, but your personal spirit. Every man had a genius, every woman a Juno. This spiritual double represented your life force. On birthdays, you honored your genius with a libation or incense. Some families kept tiny busts to represent them. This wasn't religion for salvation. It was religion for survival, a way of negotiating with unseen powers, a spiritual insurance policy. Rome's religious life extended far beyond the home. It was woven into every part of public identity. To be Roman was to participate in public religion, whether or not your heart was in it. Temples dotted every district, each dedicated to a different god. Jupiter Optimus Maximus ruled the Capitoline Hill. Juno Moneta protected the Mint. Vesta kept her eternal flame burning in the Forum, watched over by 6 virgins sworn to chastity. Mars, Minerva, Diana, Apollo, all had their cults and precincts. Each god had their own priesthood, ceremonies, and calendar of feast days. As a citizen, you didn't need to love the gods. You needed to respect them. You showed pietas, dutiful devotion, by attending public festivals, giving offerings, and obeying religious taboos. Missing a festival wasn't impious, but mocking a ritual, disrupting a sacrifice, that was dangerous, not just for you, but for the city. Romans believed that gods could punish not only individuals, but whole communities. A botched sacrifice, an impure priest, a dishonored oath, any of these could bring plague, fire, famine, or defeat in war. So rituals were conducted with obsessive precision. Animals were examined for omens. Words were spoken in exact order. Even a sneeze at the wrong moment could cancel a ceremony and force a restart. There was no church, no holy book, no central doctrine, but there was structure, and plenty of it. Priests came from the aristocracy. Offices like the Pontifex Maximus, chief priest, were coveted political roles. Religion and governance were inseparable. Every Senate meeting began with a sacrifice. Every triumphal procession passed the temples. Every major building had its own consecration. The gods were everywhere, in statues, rituals, festivals, and oaths. You swore by them. You thanked them. You feared them. But you didn't love them. That wasn't the point. Despite its seriousness, Roman religion was not grim. In fact, it was often an excuse for celebration. Rome's religious calendar was packed with feast days, over 150 per year by the imperial era. These weren't just ceremonies. They were holidays, time off work, public games, free food, wild processions. Take Saturnalia, for example, held in December in honor of the god Saturn. For several days, social norms were upended. Masters served slaves. Gambling was permitted. People wore silly hats and exchanged gifts. It was riotous, crude, and beloved. Even the sternest philosopher cracked a smile. Or Lupercalia, a February festival involving half-naked men running through the streets, striking women with thongs made from goat hide to promote fertility. It was part ritual, part farce, and entirely Roman. There were also harvest festivals, military commemorations, and days honoring particular deities. Some included sacrifices, oxen, pigs, sheep. Others had races, plays, or public banquets. Even poor citizens attended. It was their chance to taste roasted meat, see famous actors, or shout themselves hoarse at a chariot race. In these festivals, you saw Roman religion at its most vivid, part ritual, part entertainment, and fully public. Visiting a temple wasn't like going to a church or synagogue. Temples weren't places for congregation. They were the homes of gods. You didn't sit in pews. You stood outside, gave your offering, made your prayer, and left. Offerings could be anything: coins, fruit, cakes, flowers, incense. Wealthier citizens gave animals. The priest performed the sacrifice, examined the entrails for omens, and burned the appropriate parts. The rest might be eaten by the priest, the donor, or during major festivals by the crowd. Some temples had cult statues so large they were said to breathe. Others were humble roadside shrines. Many neighborhoods had Compitalia, crossroads shrines to local spirits. These were managed by locals, not priests. Even slaves could participate. Religion was not confined to sacred spaces. It was everywhere. You made the sign of the horns to ward off evil. You spat 3 times to avoid misfortune. You crossed thresholds with the right foot. You avoided certain words or days. You feared eclipses, comets, and owls. Which brings us to the undercurrent of Roman faith, superstition. The Roman world was full of unexplained forces. And where explanation failed, superstition filled the gap. Every action could carry symbolic weight. A black cat crossing your path? Bad luck. A snake in your house? A message from the gods. Dreamt of a tooth falling out? Someone close to you would die. You didn't have to be religious to be superstitious. Even emperors consulted soothsayers and astrologers. The General Sulla never left home without checking the entrails. Augustus claimed to have been conceived under a special star. Omens were everywhere, birds flying left or right, thunder at the wrong time, a sudden gust of wind. Augurs, religious officials trained in divination, interpreted these signs before major state decisions. Their readings could delay elections, postpone battles, or justify political maneuvers. Then there were curses, thin lead tablets inscribed with maledictions, buried in graves or thrown into wells. People cursed cheating lovers, rival charioteers, and dishonest business partners. Some even hired professional curse writers. Witches, love potions, and protective charms abounded. Children wore bulla amulets to protect against the evil eye. Homes hung phallic talismans to ward off envy. Farmers used spells to protect crops. Even educated Romans kept lucky charms hidden in their tunics. Official religion tolerated some of this, but go too far, especially into necromancy or foreign cults, and the authorities took notice. Despite official reverence for Roman deities, the city teemed with foreign cults. From the east came Isis, the Egyptian goddess of motherhood and mystery, Mithras, the bull-slaying god of soldiers, and Cybele, the Great Mother whose worship included ecstatic dances and self-castration. These cults promised something Roman religion didn't: personal connection, hope after death, and initiation into sacred knowledge. Many poor Romans found meaning here. The cults offered structure, purpose, even fellowship, but they also faced suspicion. Foreign rites were considered unmanly, disruptive, or secretive, dangerous traits in a society obsessed with public order. Christianity emerged in this mix. At first, it was just another Eastern sect, but its refusal to honor the Roman gods, especially the divine emperor, brought state hostility. Persecution followed: executions, torture, martyrdom. Still, the appeal spread. By the 3rd century, Christian congregations had taken root across the empire. And then the 4th, Rome would shift forever. Constantine converted. The old gods fell silent. But during the high point of Roman urban life, most people, average people, didn't hear sermons. They lit incense. They muttered charms. They feared ghosts. They thanked the Lares for another day. Religion in Rome was not about personal salvation. It was about tradition, respect, and risk management. The gods were real. They had expectations. And if you wanted your daughter to recover from a fever, your shop to survive the year, or your cousin to win his appeal, you made an offering. You might not remember the myths. You might not know your temple from your augur. But you knew this: honor the old ways, and maybe you'd stay lucky. Roman religion was everywhere. In the salt on your bread, the coin you tossed in the fountain, the quiet prayer before a journey, the nod toward a street shrine. It was not one god, it was thousands. Not one truth, but hundreds of traditions held together by habit, fear, and hope. And in the middle of it all stood the average Roman, faithful not out of zeal, but out of necessity. Rome was a city of contrasts: marble temples and wooden tenements, vast wealth and crippling poverty, soaring public ambition and deeply private lives. But beneath the grandeur, beyond the politics and pageantry, lay the foundation of all Roman life: the household. To be Roman wasn't just to be a citizen. It was to belong to a family, to a structure, to a network of obligations and expectations that stretched from cradle to grave. In the Roman world, family, familia, meant something broader than just parents and children. It included slaves, freedmen, clients, adopted heirs, and occasionally even close friends. A household could be modest or massive, humble or sprawling. But every one of them revolved around a central figure, the paterfamilias. This man, usually the eldest living male, held near absolute legal authority over the household. He could arrange marriages, approve or reject adoptions, sell or emancipate slaves, and even, in earlier periods, execute his children without state interference. Though such powers were rarely exercised in the harshest form by the imperial era, the symbolic weight remained. The paterfamilias was Rome's domestic emperor. Under his roof lived his wife, materfamilias, children, sometimes grandchildren, and often enslaved workers or clients. Together, they formed a social and economic unit, producing goods, managing resources, transmitting names and values. Family was not sentimental. It was structural, a means of preserving legacy, property, and status. Love? That was a nice bonus if you were lucky. Marriage in ancient Rome was primarily a contract, a legal arrangement between two families, often cemented with a dowry and chosen more for political or economic alliance than emotional connection. Girls were typically married between the ages of 12 and 15, often to men a decade or more older. Consent was technically required, but in practice, the father decided. Boys, especially those from wealthier families, married later, in their 20s, after establishing a career or position. Weddings were public affairs. The bride wore a flame-colored veil, the groom a traditional toga. Rituals were followed: the clasping of hands, the offering of fire and water, the symbolic carrying of the bride over the threshold. The wedding night marked her departure from one household to another and the beginning of a new set of duties. Once married, a woman was expected to manage the home, bear children, and embody pudicitia, modesty and sexual virtue. Unlike in earlier Republican times, by the 1st century CE, wives could retain ownership of their dowry and property, especially in elite circles. Divorce, too, was legal and relatively common, initiated by either party, often for political or financial reasons. Yet for all its practicality, Roman marriage wasn't without affection. Letters, epitaphs, and poems speak of deep bonds, of wives praised as my light, my soul, my friend. Some couples clearly loved each other, but society didn't expect it. Duty came first. Roman society was patriarchal, not just in structure, but in ideology. Men were expected to be active, rational, political. Women, passive, modest, domestic. The male was the civis, the citizen, with rights to vote, hold office, and serve in the military. The woman, though essential to family life, was confined by legal and cultural limitations. Public life was for men. The forum, the Senate, the army, the courts, these were male arenas. A woman's voice was not welcome in politics or public debate. Even public speaking by women was considered scandalous unless it related to religious or funerary rites. But that's the theory. In reality, Roman women, especially of the lower classes, worked. They sold produce in the markets, ran taverns, wove textiles, nursed the sick, and even acted as moneylenders. They managed estates, handled slaves, and occasionally wielded real influence behind the scenes, particularly mothers of emperors or wives of governors. Elite women were expected to be chaste, graceful, and loyal. Poor women were expected to survive, and survive they did, raising children, managing homes, enduring pregnancy and childbirth with no modern medicine. Some died young. Others outlived their husbands and became powerful matriarchs. Women were not equal, but they were central. Children were treasured but also trained. A Roman child was first and foremost a future adult. From an early age, boys were taught discipline, duty, and Roman virtues: bravery, loyalty, thrift. Girls were taught household skills, modesty, and obedience. Wealthier children were educated at home by tutors or in private schools. Boys studied Latin, Greek, rhetoric, and law, preparing for public careers. Girls, if educated at all, learned reading, writing, and arithmetic to manage household affairs. Poorer children learned by doing. A baker's son might knead dough by age 7. A weaver's daughter might spin wool before her first period. Many were apprenticed or worked with their parents from a young age. Childhood mortality was high. Inscriptions often commemorate sons and daughters who died before puberty. The Roman world was brutal in this regard. If a child survived to 10, it was considered a small miracle. Children were also part of religion. They wore protective amulets, bulla for boys, lunula for girls, to ward off evil. Boys gave up their bulla when they donned the toga of manhood around age 15 or 16, marking their legal transition to adulthood. But childhood was short and often hard. No discussion of family or social structure in Rome is complete without acknowledging slavery. Slaves were not just laborers, they were part of the familia. They cleaned, cooked, raised children, taught lessons, kept books, farmed land, and served meals. Some were treated well, others endured relentless abuse. Their status was non-human, property, not person. Yet many Romans had daily contact with enslaved people. Even poor households might own one or two. They were nurses, companions, clerks, lovers, and even managers. Their work allowed Roman citizens to perform their civic roles. Some slaves gained manumission, their freedom, and became liberty, or freedmen. Freedmen could marry, own property, and even accumulate wealth, but their status remained marked. They could never hold public office, and their children carried the social stain. Still, many freedmen became essential parts of Roman society, especially in business, trade, and administration. Their rise speaks to the fluidity and brutality of Rome's social order. Roman society was rigid, but not immobile. At the top were the senators, landowning aristocrats who held political power. Below them, the equites, the knightly class, rich but not noble. Then came the plebeians, the bulk of Roman citizens, farmers, artisans, merchants, laborers. Beneath them were the liberti, freedmen. And at the bottom, the servi, slaves. Class determined everything: your clothes, your education, your diet, your punishments in court. A senator might wear a toga with a broad purple stripe. A freedman wore simpler garments. A slave, none at all. And yet, movement was possible. A freedman's son could rise to wealth. A clever equestrian could buy land and enter the Senate. The military offered a ladder for the poor. Commerce, too, if you were lucky, shrewd, and male. Status was visible. Titles mattered. Names mattered. Every tombstone listed one's social position, even among the poor. Identity in Rome was a combination of blood, patronage, reputation, and display. Social structure wasn't just about class, it was about connection. Rome ran on clientela, the system of patronage. A patron, patroness, offered protection, legal help, food, or money. A client, cliens, offered loyalty, political support, and public praise. Every morning, clients lined up outside their patron's house, a ritual called the salutatio. They greeted him, sometimes received a small gift or meal, and accompanied him through the forum to show his influence. This system permeated all levels of society. Even freedmen were expected to serve their former masters as clients. In return, patrons offered stability, honor, and occasionally opportunity. It was an unspoken contract, one of mutual obligation and carefully preserved hierarchy. When a Roman died, their family's duty began anew. Funerals were public, symbolic acts. The body was washed, dressed, and displayed. Professional mourners might wail. Ancestral masks were carried through the streets. Eulogies were given. Tombs were inscribed with family achievements and social status. For the poor, cremation or burial was simpler, sometimes paid for by a collegium, a burial club. But even the humblest Roman wanted to be remembered. A family tomb wasn't just a resting place. It was a legacy, a statement, a piece of permanence in a city where lives were often short and fragile. Inscriptions often included touching phrases, "To the best of wives," "A son taken too soon," "He worked hard and harmed no one." Death was a family matter, and remembrance a final gift. To be Roman was to live within a structure, not just of laws or gods, but of people. You were born into a family that taught you who you were. Your name carried your father's history. Your role reflected your gender. Your prospects mirrored your class. And your duty to family, to ancestors, to society shaped every choice. Yet within these boundaries, Romans found meaning. The mother braiding her daughter's hair, the freedman saving to buy his son a better life, the soldier riding home, the girl lighting incense at the family shrine. They weren't just names on stone. They were families, living, laughing, working, weeping, building a world that was brutal, complex, and at times profoundly human. To be Roman wasn't simply a matter of where you lived. It was a matter of who you were, legally, socially, and symbolically. In a world without passports or identity cards, civitas, citizenship, was your greatest asset. It determined not only what rights you held, but what punishments you could face, what ambitions you could pursue, and even how you died. For the average Roman citizen, life was shaped by this invisible but powerful web of legal distinctions, social markers, and rigid hierarchies, upheld not just by custom, but by law. Rome, at its heart, was a legal machine, and everyone, man, woman, child, slave, and citizen, lived somewhere along its great spinning wheel of status. Let's begin with the most coveted status in the ancient world, civis Romanus, the Roman citizen. Originally, Roman citizenship was restricted to those born in the city and its immediate environs, but as Rome expanded through conquest and colonization, citizenship spread. By the 1st century CE, citizens could be found across the Italian peninsula and increasingly throughout the provinces, Spain, Gaul, North Africa, and the Levant. To be a citizen meant legal protection. You could marry legally. You could own property. You could sue and be sued. You could appeal in court. You could not be tortured, executed without trial, or crucified, punishments reserved for slaves and non-citizens. Only citizens could vote in elections, though by the empire this right had become ceremonial. Only citizens could serve in elite legions, stand for office, or don the toga virilis, the man's toga, that symbolized civic maturity. But not all citizens were equal. Roman society was finely stratified. Even among citizens, your rights and your visibility varied dramatically. At the top were the senatorial class, landowning aristocrats who needed a minimum wealth of 1 million sesterces. They could sit in the Senate, hold the most prestigious offices, and command legions. Their sons were groomed from birth for politics. Next were the equestrians, equites, the business class. With a minimum wealth requirement of 400,000 sesterces, they were tax collectors, bankers, administrators, and entrepreneurs. Some were richer than senators, but barred from office. Many bridged the worlds of finance and state. Below them were the plebeians, the bulk of Roman citizens, artisans, farmers, shopkeepers, and laborers. Most were poor, but proud. They could vote, marry, enlist, and own land. Many joined guilds, collegia, shared burial societies, and served in lower administrative posts. They were the true backbone of Roman civic life. Then came freedmen, liberty, former slaves who had earned or been granted freedom. They were citizens, but with limitations. They could not hold elected office. Their children, however, were fully enfranchised. Many freedmen became wealthy, especially in commerce, but social stigma remained. And beneath all these were non-citizens, peregrini, free people of the empire who lacked Roman citizenship. They had no voting rights, no legal marriage, and fewer legal protections. Some lived in client kingdoms, others in Roman provinces. But their path to full status was limited and long, unless bought through military service, patronage, or imperial favor. Finally, there were the slaves, servi. They were property. They had no legal personhood. They could not marry, own anything, or testify in court, except under torture. The Roman world was thus not just a pyramid, it was a lattice of privilege. Your rights weren't guaranteed by morality or humanity, but by your place on the civic ladder. Unlike modern states, Rome had no ID cards, but status was visible in practice and enforced by ritual and law. A citizen wore a toga, heavy, white, and symbolic. Only citizens could wear it. The toga praetexta with a purple stripe was reserved for magistrates and some children. The toga candida, bleached bright, marked those running for office. At official events, courtrooms, assemblies, funerals, social distinctions were rigidly enforced. Senators sat in reserved rows. Equestrians wore gold rings and sat behind. Plebeians stood. Freedmen watched from the margins. Proof of citizenship might also involve registration. Every citizen was listed in a census, updated every 5 years. Your name, family, tribe, and property were recorded. Citizenship could be inherited through the father or granted by special decree, for instance, to soldiers on discharge. Foreigners could become citizens through years of loyal service, especially in the military. In 212 CE, Emperor Caracalla granted citizenship to nearly all free men in the empire with the Constitutio Antoniniana. But by then, the legal weight of citizenship had begun to erode. Rome's legal system was one of its most enduring achievements. It codified not only crimes and contracts, but also inheritance, commerce, marriage, and citizenship itself. For the average Roman, the law wasn't abstract. It was lived experience. Contracts were everywhere, for rent, loans, apprenticeships, dowries. Even verbal agreements held legal weight, especially if witnessed. Courts were accessible, if not always just. You could sue your neighbor for damage to property, for breach of contract, or for assault. But winning required eloquence, connections, and sometimes bribes. Wealthier Romans hired advocates. Poorer ones relied on patrons or gave up. Judges were appointed by magistrates. Juries were made up of citizens. Verdicts could be appealed, up to the emperor in theory. Roman law was especially harsh on slaves and non-citizens. A slave who struck a master could be executed. If a master was murdered, all his household slaves could be put to death. Theft, desertion, and adultery carried severe penalties. Yet Roman law also showed surprising sophistication. They had laws for contracts, torts, property, and succession. Legal manuals like the 12 Tables and later Corpus Juris Civilis laid the groundwork for European legal systems centuries later. What happened if you broke the law? That depended on who you were. A Roman citizen might be fined, exiled, or in extreme cases, executed by beheading, but they could not be crucified. That was reserved for slaves, pirates, and the worst criminals. Common punishments included fines for minor offenses, whipping or scourging for theft or public disorder, exile for political dissent, adultery or fraud, forced labor in mines or quarries, crucifixion, the most humiliating death, usually for slaves or rebels, damnatio ad bestias, death by wild animals in the arena, often a spectacle. Justice wasn't blind. It was social. Your class, patronage, and connections mattered more than the evidence. A senator might face exile for treason, a slave, instant death. Still, many ordinary Romans respected the law. It gave predictability. It offered a way to settle disputes without violence, and it reinforced the civic identity that separated Romans from the rest of the world. For the poor, the courts were not always accessible, but they weren't cut off. If you had a patron, they could speak on your behalf, provide legal counsel, or exert influence. This was the foundation of clientela, the mutual obligation between patron and client. Legal protection was one of its key functions. Inscriptions frequently honor patrons, to Gaius Livius, who defended us in court, obtained grain, and protected our sons. A patron could be a lifeline, legally and socially. Technically, citizens could vote in Rome's assemblies. They elected magistrates, passed laws, and approved declarations of war. In reality, by the imperial period, these powers were symbolic. Emperors controlled legislation. Magistrates served at their pleasure. Voting still occurred, especially for show, but the people no longer ruled. Still, civic rituals remained. Elections were held in the Campus Marsus. Voters were sorted into tribes. Candidates wore toga candida and handed out small gifts or meals. Political graffiti appeared on walls. Vote for Marcus, the baker's friend. Even plebeians could hold minor office, as aediles, quaestors, or local magistrates. Ambitious men from humble origins sometimes rose, if not to the Senate, then at least to wealth and respect. Women, however, were excluded from formal political rights. They could not vote or hold office, but they could influence as mothers, wives, and widows. A well-connected matron could sway her husband, her sons, even the emperor. As the empire expanded, citizenship extended far beyond the city's walls. Roman law followed Roman citizens in Gaul, Judea, Britannia, and Egypt. In the provinces, citizenship became a marker of prestige. Local elites sought it. Soldiers earned it. Whole cities petitioned for it. By the 2nd century CE, a hybrid identity emerged, Roman in law, local in culture. A Gallic landowner might pray to Celtic gods, but still register as a Roman citizen, pay taxes, and send his son to a Roman school. This extension of citizenship helped unify the empire and eventually dilute its exclusivity. When Caracalla granted it broadly in 212 CE, some saw it as a way to increase tax revenue. Others saw it as the final leveling of old distinctions. Either way, the meaning of civis Romanus changed, from elite privilege to imperial standard. In modern terms, citizenship is a given, a birthright, a passport, a voting card. In Rome, it was an identity worn with pride and protected by law. It gave shape to society. It granted rights and imposed duties. It defined what you could own, how you were punished, who you could marry, and how you were remembered. For the average Roman citizen, the law wasn't just an abstract code. It was a lived reality. It governed how they worked, how they prayed, how they married, and how they died. And in the cracks between law and practice, between right and might, Romans lived out their days. Some in togas, some in chains, but all under the eye of a system that prized order, hierarchy, and the eternal city itself. Rome was built on blood. Its borders were drawn by marching feet and sharpened steel. Its economy thrived on conquest. Its very identity, the heart of what it meant to be Roman, was bound to war. The average citizen lived in the shadow of this military machine, benefiting from its spoils or bearing its cost. And for many, the path to honor, wealth, or even citizenship lay through the life of a soldier. Rome didn't just have an army, it was an army. At times, a republic of warriors, later an empire guarded by legions stationed from the moors of Britain to the sands of Arabia. For the common man, war was both a threat and an opportunity. And for the empire, soldiers were more than fighters. They were engineers, administrators, colonists, and symbols of Roman power. In the early republic, all soldiers were citizens. To serve in the Roman army, you needed to own property. War was seasonal, a campaign fought in spring and summer with the expectation that men would return to farm their fields. But as Rome expanded, war became constant. The legions became professional. By the 1st century BCE, service was a full-time job, 25 years for infantry, 26 or more for auxiliaries. Veterans were granted land, pensions, or citizenship. In return, they gave their youth to the empire. By the imperial era, the army had become a career path, especially for the poor, landless, or provincials seeking advancement. For many, it was their only chance at a stable income, regular meals, and a place in Roman society. Imagine waking before dawn in a cramped leather tent, shoulder to shoulder with 7 other men. The air is cold. Your armor, segmentata, lies by your side, alongside your shield, helmet, javelin, and short sword, gladius. A Roman soldier's day began early. Duties rotated: standing guard, training, patrol, cooking, construction. Breakfast was simple: bread, cheese, perhaps dried meat. Meals were cooked in squads, contubernia, fostering tight-knit camaraderie. Training was relentless. Marching 30 kilometers with full kit, weapons drills, formation practice, construction of camps, walls, roads. A Roman soldier was not just a warrior, he was a builder, digger, engineer. Pay was steady, though deductions for food, equipment, and clothing were common. Bonuses came during victories, from emperors, or on retirement. Loot was a powerful motivator. A successful campaign could mean real riches, but life was also brutally hard. Punishment was severe. Disobedience, cowardice, or desertion could lead to flogging, execution, or decimation, where 1 in 10 men from a disgraced unit was killed by lot. Yet discipline made Rome's army terrifying. It marched with precision, camped with efficiency, and fought with methodical brutality. A legionary's equipment was designed for close quarters dominance. The gladius, a short, double-edged stabbing sword, brutal in tight formation. The pilum, a heavy javelin designed to bend on impact, disabling enemy shields. The scutum, a curved rectangular shield, perfect for the tight testudo formation. Armor, lorica segmentata or chainmail, lorica hamata, plus a metal helmet with cheek guards. Together, these tools formed a unit capable of facing larger, looser enemies and winning not just through strength, but discipline. Behind the lines, soldiers had siege engines, ballistae, catapults, battering rams. Rome wasn't just tactically superior, it was technologically relentless. Not all soldiers were citizens. In fact, many were not. The auxiliaries were non-citizen troops recruited from the provinces, archers from Syria, cavalry from Gaul, slingers from the Balearic Islands. These men fought alongside the legions, but with different gear, tactics, and roles. Service in the auxilia lasted 25 years. On retirement, the soldier, and often his family, received Roman citizenship. For many, it was a path into the empire's inner circle. Though auxiliaries were viewed as second tier, they were essential, guarding frontiers, scouting, garrisoning forts, and dying in droves. Every night, the Roman army built a camp. It didn't matter if they were moving again the next day. Camps were sacred spaces, rectangular, ordered, fortified. Each soldier had a designated place. There were granaries, forges, latrines, headquarters, and shrines. The layout was consistent across the empire. A soldier from Syria could find his way around a camp in Britain without asking directions. In peacetime, these camps became permanent fortresses. Around them, towns grew: taverns, markets, baths, brothels. Soldiers took local lovers, fathered children, officially forbidden, unofficially common, and mingled with civilians. Some camps eventually became cities: Vienna, Cologne, Chester. The army brought not only violence, but urbanization. Rome's empire was not built by diplomacy alone. It expanded through warfare, fueled by conquest and justified by civilizing missions. Conquered lands provided slaves, tribute, and land for veterans. New provinces were pacified with roads, forts, and colonists, many of them ex-soldiers. A legion might fight in Germania 1 year, then settle in Spain the next. The army was also a tool of Romanization. Soldiers brought language, law, architecture, and religion. A Roman camp came with temples to Jupiter, shrines to the emperor, and statues of Mars. Yet the army also absorbed local culture. Soldiers stationed in the east worshipped Mithras. Others picked up local wives, customs, even accents. Roman identity was elastic, enforced from above, but adapted on the ground. For all its glory, war came with a human cost. The Republic's endless campaigns left thousands dead and thousands more crippled. Wounded veterans begged in the streets. Families were displaced. Provinces burned. Slavery expanded with every conquest. After the fall of Carthage, the survivors were sold en masse. After the Jewish revolt, tens of thousands were paraded in chains. Even within Rome, war's cost was visible. Monuments celebrated victory, but trauma echoed in the minds of veterans. Some returned to farms, others never returned at all. And when soldiers were neglected, unpaid, abused, or alienated, they became a threat. Legions rebelled. Generals turned on Rome. Emperors were made and unmade by the sword. Despite hardship, the soldier was respected. Not aristocratically, senators disdained military careers, but popularly. To be a soldier was to be part of Rome's foundation. The city was founded by Romulus, who killed his brother. Mars was the father of the Roman people. Even Augustus, the peacebringer, made sure his statue wore armor. Soldiers earned land, pensions, and public monuments. Their tombs record their names, ranks, and campaigns. Their children inherited their honor. And yet the army was also a class separator. Wealthier Romans served as officers, tribunes, or cavalry. The rank and file were plebeian. Discipline was rigid. Disrespect flowed downhill. But there was room for heroism. Centurions, officers promoted from the ranks, commanded fear and admiration. Some became famous. Others died anonymously, speared on distant frontiers. By the 2nd century CE, the empire stretched from the Euphrates to the Scottish Highlands. Its borders were guarded by legions, each with its own number, emblem, and home. Life on the frontier was monotonous, broken by skirmishes, building projects, and the occasional barbarian raid. In Britannia, soldiers shivered behind Hadrian's wall, watching the mist for painted tribes. In Dacia, they stood in alpine forts, eyes on the passes. In Judea, they marched in dust, wary of ambush. Some soldiers loved the frontier. Land was plentiful. Danger brought honor. Local girls were welcoming. Others hated it, isolated, harsh, and far from Rome. Yet these soldiers were Rome's true face, the edge where civilization met chaos. A Roman soldier swore loyalty, not to the state, but to his commander, and later to the emperor. This was both strength and danger. A beloved general could command legions to march on Rome, as Caesar did. Soldiers could proclaim a new emperor, as they did with Vespasian, Septimius Severus, or countless usurpers. The emperor was thus dependent on the army. He paid them bonuses, donativa, lavished them with praise, and toured provinces to win their hearts. When loyalty failed, chaos followed. The crisis of the 3rd century saw dozens of emperors rise and fall, often declared by legions. Rome didn't just fear invasion, it feared its own soldiers. And yet the empire endured, because through it all, the soldier kept marching. For the average Roman soldier, life was not easy. It was cold, painful, and often short, but it offered structure, pay, brotherhood, status, and for many, a ticket into Roman identity. The army wasn't just a killing machine. It was a colonizing force, a civic tool, a social ladder, a living expression of Rome's will to dominate. The empire was paved by swords, policed by boots, and defended by thousands of men whose names we don't know, but whose labors built the roads we still walk, the walls we still see, and the myths we still remember. Rome was eternal, because her soldiers made it so. In the Roman world, death was not an end. It was a transition from the world of the living to the shadowy realm beyond, where memory, honor, and ritual kept the soul from vanishing altogether. To be Roman was to prepare for death long before it came. Whether you were rich or poor, citizen or slave, you would face death with a mix of fear, reverence, and stubborn practicality. And how you died and how you were remembered mattered almost as much as how you lived. Because in Rome, the dead were not gone. They lingered in tombs, whispered in dreams, and haunted those who failed to honor them properly. Step just outside the walls of any Roman city, along the Appian Way in Rome, or the road to Herculaneum in Pompeii, and you'd find the tombs. Rows of them, big and small. Statues, altars, urns, stone sarcophagi. Some proudly announced who lay within: Lucius, freedman of Gaius, baker of the first quality. Others bore only initials, their inscriptions half worn by centuries of wind and foot traffic. Roman law forbade burials within the city walls, so the dead lined the roads leading out, not hidden, but proudly on display. The living passed them daily, reminded of their ancestors, their status, and their own eventual fate. To be buried in stone was a statement. You had lived, you were Roman, and someone had cared enough to mark your place. When death came, whether by illness, old age, or violence, the rituals began. The eldest son or closest relative would kneel and try to catch the dying person's last breath with a kiss, guiding their soul out of the body. The eyes were closed. The body was washed, anointed with oils, and dressed in a toga if male, perhaps with garlands if female or young. Coins were placed on the eyes or in the mouth, obelisks, payment for Charon, the ferryman of the underworld. Even poor families scraped together a few coppers for the sacred gesture. To enter the afterlife unprepared was to risk wandering as a ghost. In wealthier homes, mourners were hired, women paid to wail, beat their chests, and sing dirges. This wasn't seen as theatrical. It was part of honoring the dead. Emotion was public, noisy, and necessary. The body was laid out in the atrium for several days, allowing friends, neighbors, and clients to pay respects. Then came the procession. Down the main roads of the city, a cortege moved musicians, torchbearers, family members, freedmen, clients. If the deceased was elite, actors might wear wax masks, imagines of ancestors, impersonating their likeness and even their voices. The body itself was carried on a bier, followed by the family. A eulogy, laudatio, might be delivered at the forum, recounting the person's virtues, offices held, battles fought, or children raised. The funeral ended at the burial site. The body was either cremated, the more traditional method, or buried whole, which became increasingly common during the imperial period. In the Republic, cremation was the norm. The body was burned on a pyre, the ashes collected in an urn, and placed in a columbarium, a communal tomb resembling a dovecot. But by the 2nd century CE, inhumation, burial of the whole body, became popular, influenced in part by Eastern religions and emerging Christian beliefs. Graves varied by class. A senator might have a marble mausoleum with carved reliefs. A plebeian might have a small stone box, shared with others. A slave might be buried in an unmarked pit, unless their master showed rare generosity. Even so, funerary clubs, collegia funeraricia, allowed poor Romans to pool resources for a proper burial. Membership ensured a tomb, a ritual, and a name carved in stone. Death was the great leveler, but only if you planned ahead. Ask a Roman what happens after death, and you'd get a shrug, a prayer, or a recitation of myth. The beliefs were rich, but rarely consistent. The traditional vision came from poets, a journey to the underworld ruled by Pluto and Proserpina, where souls crossed the Styx with Charon and faced judgment. The good found peace in the Elysian fields. The wicked suffered in Tartarus. But these were moral tales, not doctrine. In daily life, Romans were less concerned with paradise or damnation. They feared becoming a lemur, a restless spirit, denied peace due to improper burial, violent death, or unfinished business. To prevent this, families offered food, wine, and prayers. On the festival of Parentalia in February, Romans visited tombs, cleaned graves, and left offerings for ancestors. Forgetting the dead risked inviting them back, not in comfort, but in vengeance. Romans didn't expect divine reward. They wanted rest, remembrance, and a good reputation. Roman tombstones tell their own stories, often short, poignant, and deeply human. Some tombs boasted success, twice consul, friend of the emperor. Others were humble. He worked hard, harmed no one, and died too soon. Children's graves were particularly heartbreaking, often adorned with toys, dolls, or birds in flight. Epitaphs served two purposes. One was honor, to display achievements, family, and virtue. The other was memory, to preserve a name even when the flesh had gone. To be forgotten was the final death. Romans grieved publicly and structurally. Mourning periods were defined by custom, 9 days for ordinary citizens, up to a year for prominent figures. Women wore dark veils. Men might grow beards or avoid public life. Families abstained from festivals. In elite households, ancestral masks were placed in shrines. But mourning had its limits. Prolonged grief was discouraged. Stoic philosophy, popular among Roman elites, taught that death was natural and not to be feared. To weep too long was seen as weakness or impiety. Yet grief found its way into poetry. Poets like Catullus, Ovid, and Martial wrote elegies for lost friends, siblings, and lovers. Their verses preserved not only lives, but feelings, the sting of loss, the ache of memory. Despite their public stoicism, Romans feared ghosts. Houses were said to be haunted by unburied or unjustly killed spirits. Dreams carried warnings from the dead. Ghosts, manes, larvae, lemurs appeared in mirrors, wells, or dark corners. Protective charms were common. Prayers and exorcisms, though informal, were used. Stories circulated of haunted baths, cursed tombs, or voices crying in the night. The Roman underworld wasn't hell, but it was crowded, mysterious, and always close. The living honored the dead not just out of love, but fear. As Rome absorbed other cultures, new ideas of death emerged. The Egyptian cult of Isis promised rebirth and eternal life. Followers underwent rituals of purification and symbolic resurrection. Statues of Isis holding her son Harpocrates appeared across the empire, maternal, divine, comforting. The cult of Mithras, popular with soldiers, portrayed the soul ascending through cosmic spheres after death. Initiates sought salvation through secret rites and underground temples. And then came Christianity, offering not only a heaven, but a personal resurrection, a God who conquered death, and a moral framework for eternal judgment. By the 3rd century, Christian burials included symbols of hope: doves, fish, loaves, and the Chiro. Graves were placed in catacombs, marked not with achievements, but faith. This vision, revolutionary and radical, gradually replaced Rome's older, ritualistic view. The soul mattered more than the tomb, memory more than marble. Death in ancient Rome was a civic act, a family duty, and a ritual performance. The poor were buried in mass graves, the rich in stone. But all Romans, from the humblest freedmen to the most exalted consul, shared the same fears: to die unloved, to be forgotten, to wander unremembered. They fought back with tombs, inscriptions, prayers, and offerings. They carved their names in stone. They whispered to the manes. They honored the Lares. Because in Rome, to be dead was not to vanish. It was to be carried forward in memory, in ritual, in name. And as long as someone passed your grave and said your name aloud, you had not truly died. Despite its wars, laws, and rigid structure, Rome was not a joyless place. It was a city of indulgence, of hot baths and wine-soaked dinners, of street performers and roaring arenas, of gossip and smoky taverns and laughter spilling out of public latrines. The Romans worked hard, but they also played hard. And leisure was not just permitted, it was expected. It was the sign of a civilized man. For the average Roman, leisure wasn't luxury. It was the art of navigating life's discomforts with pleasure, creativity, and rhythm. A way of reminding oneself amid the toil of trade and tyranny that there was still joy to be found in bread, wine, and a well-timed nap. The Roman day was divided not by clocks, but by sunlight. It began with the prima ora, first hour, shortly after sunrise, and ended with sunset. Business, markets, and politics took place in the morning. Afternoons were for meals, bathing, socializing, and leisure. A poor craftsman might rise before dawn, work until noon, then rest. A wealthier Roman might attend clients in the morning, spend midday at the baths, and dine with friends until late. Unlike modern life, where work and leisure are strictly separated, the Roman experience was fluid. Time was guided more by season and social role than the tyranny of the clock. Nothing symbolized Roman leisure better than the public baths, the thermae. These were not just places to wash. They were the heart of daily life. Wellness centers, gossip hubs, libraries, gyms, and dining halls rolled into one. Even modest towns had baths. In Rome, colossal complexes like the baths of Caracalla or Trajan could accommodate thousands. Entry was cheap or free, subsidized by the state. Rich and poor alike stripped down and mingled, united by steam, sweat, and the scent of olive oil. A typical bath ritual began with exercise in the palestra, boxing, wrestling, or ball games. Then came the hot rooms, caldarium, warm rooms, tepidarium, and cold plunges, frigidarium. Oil was applied and scraped off with a curved blade, strigil, removing dirt and dead skin. Business deals were struck in the baths. Poems recited. Scandals whispered. Politicians observed. Bodies admired. Baths weren't just hygienic, they were democratic. A banker and a beggar might bathe side by side. For a few hours at least, the empire's sharp class lines were softened by steam. Roman cuisine ranged from rustic simplicity to imperial extravagance. The poor ate pulse, a porridge of grain, water, and sometimes vegetables. Bread was the staple, hard loaves baked in communal ovens, dipped in wine or oil. Cheese, onions, olives, and lentils rounded out the diet. Meat was rare, often salted or dried. Street food thrived. Vendors sold libum, cheese bread, chickpea patties, sausages, and honey cakes. Many Romans lived in Insulae, crowded flats without kitchens, and relied on food stalls or taverns, pupaini, for hot meals. The rich feasted differently. A convivium, dinner party, might include several courses: dormice stuffed with nuts, fish and garum sauce, roast boar, and honey-glazed fruits. Wine flowed freely, often watered down and spiced. Entertainment might include music, dance, or readings from Virgil. Reclining on couches, guests followed strict etiquette. Conversations meandered from poetry to politics to gossip. Slaves served, cleaned, fanned, and performed. For Romans, eating was social theater. Even the philosopher Seneca, who preached moderation, admitted that a good meal restored the soul. Romans drank wine with nearly every meal, but always diluted. Drinking it neat was barbaric. Wine came in many varieties: white, red, aged, sweet, sour, cheap, or impossibly expensive. Amphorae were marked with origin and quality. The best came from Campania, Falernian vineyards, or Greek islands. Poorer Romans drank wine flavored with resin, seawater, or herbs. It was often sour but strong. To sweeten it, they added honey or fruit. Public drunkenness was frowned upon, especially among the elite, but private indulgence was common. Poets wrote odes to wine. Soldiers toasted before battle. Emperors, like Tiberius or Nero, hosted lavish symposia where wine flowed like rivers, sometimes to fatal effect. Romans loved spectacle. Theaters, arenas, circuses, and amphitheaters were built across the empire. Entry was often free, funded by emperors, politicians, or wealthy patrons seeking public favor. The Colosseum, Rome's grand amphitheater, held over 50,000 spectators. Events included gladiatorial combat. Armed men, often slaves or criminals, fought for fame, freedom, or survival. Venations, animal hunts featuring lions, elephants, crocodiles, and more. Public executions, criminals were sometimes thrown to beasts or forced to reenact myths with deadly outcomes. Mock naval battles, staged in flooded arenas, complete with ships. The Circus Maximus hosted chariot races, the most beloved sport in Rome. Factions, reds, blues, greens, whites, commanded fanatical loyalty. Drivers, like Gaius Appuleius Diocles, were heroes, the Formula One stars of their day. Applause was deafening. Bets were placed. Riots sometimes broke out. For many citizens, these games were their only escape from drudgery. And emperors knew it. As Juvenal put it, the people were kept content with bread and circuses. Art wasn't confined to temples or villas. Romans enjoyed theater, comedies, tragedies, and bawdy farce. Actors were often low status, but their performances drew massive crowds. Music filled daily life. Lutes, flutes, lyres, and tambourines accompanied banquets, festivals, and prayers. Soldiers sang marching songs. Farmers sang to pass time in the fields. Mosaics adorned floors. Frescoes covered walls. Even the poor decorated their homes with painted gods or nature scenes. Art wasn't just decoration, it was identity. A mosaic of Dionysus in a tavern signaled revelry. A fresco of Hercules in a bathhouse meant strength. Everywhere, color and story met the eye. The Roman calendar was filled with holidays, over 100 public festivals per year. These included Saturnalia, December, a week-long festival of gift-giving, role reversals, and general misrule. Masters served slaves. Dice games were legal. Everyone wore red caps and shouted, "Eo Saturnalia." Lupercalia, February. Men in loincloths ran through the streets, gently striking women with strips of goat hide to encourage fertility. Floralia, April. A raucous celebration of flowers and fertility, often including nude performances and public games. Parentalia, February. A solemn time to honor the dead with offerings and prayers at family tombs. These festivals mixed religion, pleasure, and civic pride. They gave structure to the year and respite from routine. Romans were frank about sex. It was a fact of life, depicted in graffiti, mosaics, and poetry. Brothels were legal and common, often marked by phallic symbols carved into stone. Attitudes varied. Male dominance was the norm, and social status dictated acceptability. A citizen man could sleep with slaves, prostitutes, or concubines without shame. But chastity was expected from citizen women, at least in theory. Love poetry, especially by Ovid, Catullus, and Propertius, revealed the tender, painful, and often comic side of Roman desire. Affairs, heartbreaks, and sexual exploits filled scrolls and song. Sexuality was more fluid than modern categories. Relationships between older men and younger boys were tolerated, though often looked down on in elite circles. Female desire was both mocked and feared, often portrayed as wild and ungovernable. Pleasure in Roman eyes was natural, but best enjoyed with moderation and control. Romans loved games. Dice, tesserae, were everywhere, carved from bone, ivory, or clay. Betting was common, though frowned upon by moralists. Board games like Ludus Latrunculorum, a strategy game similar to chess, and Tabula, an ancestor of backgammon, were played in homes and taverns. Children played with knucklebones, spinning tops, and dolls. People found joy in everyday acts, watching a fire at night, strolling through a market, playing music, or gossiping at the baths. Life was harsh, but not humorless. To be Roman wasn't just to obey, fight, or endure. It was to live fully, loudly, colorfully. Leisure wasn't escape. It was affirmation. A way of saying, yes, life is hard, but we are still here. Still laughing, still bathing, still raising toasts to Fortuna. The average Roman citizen found joy not in marble palaces or epic poems, but in warm bread, hot baths, cheap wine, and time shared with others. In the streets and taverns, the theaters and festivals, Rome throbbed with life. A world of dust and stone, yes, but also of song, scent, flavor, and laughter. And in that joy, fragile, fleeting, fiercely defended, we glimpse the soul of a people who refused to be remembered only for conquest.